are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me as always, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. Glad to have you listening in for our Tuesday episode. A second straight week that we're going to be switching things up a little bit. Normally we'd be doing Throwback Tuesday, but there's so much going on with the Seahawks in regard to news. Obviously, Russell Wilson's injury. There's plenty of after effects from that. Some big roster changes coming today as well. We're going to be breaking down the latest move made by the Seahawks in their secondary, and we're going to be dishing out some grades on the defensive side of the football with our quarterly report card. So without further ado, let's get to it. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. This episode is brought your way by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. After 3+ seasons with the team, the Seahawks and Tre Flowers have decided to split up. According to Ian Rappaport today, Flowers requested a release from the Seahawks shortly after he was benched in favor of Sidney Jones going into Week 4. The Seahawks have decided to oblige to that request. They're going to be moving on from him, and I think the timing of this is not surprising, Rob, because Tre Brown returned to practice last week, the 4th-round pick out of Oklahoma. Looks like he's going to be in good position to potentially be activated to the 53-man roster this week. This now allows the Seahawks to be able to do that. From my knowledge, this move has yet to officially be made. It was not on the transaction wire yet, but it sounds like it's imminent. They are going to be releasing Tre Flowers, so they will be able to potentially put Tre Brown on the roster as a replacement in the secondary, or that roster spot could be used to get another quarterback on the roster. Certainly they could move Jake Luton up from the practice squad. They worked out Blake Bortles today as well. Maybe that would be a last-minute signing to put on their 53-man roster, a QB that's familiar with Shane Waldron from their time together with the Rams. But either way, I'm not surprised by the timing here, and I'm not surprised that Tre Flowers, considering everything that went down, wanted out at this point.
Yeah, I think that he's basically been made a scapegoat. We've seen that Sidney Jones, who was, of course, brought in via trade here just recently by the Seahawks, has moved up to become the starter, and yet he has given up every bit as many passing yards and passing touchdowns as which Tre Flowers has given up during his time with this season as well as in the past. And I think that's unfortunate because I think that Tre Flowers is a good football player. And I think that the Seahawks are obviously in very desperate need of playmakers at the cornerback position. We're going to be kind of talking about how there has been such turnover at the cornerback position so far. So I would agree with you on the one hand that it's not surprising. At the same time, I would also argue that it is disappointing. I think that the Pittsburgh Steelers, obviously this week's opponent, would be one of the teams in which Tre Flowers could have had some success. There's not a lot of straight line speed guys in the Pittsburgh Steelers. There weren't a lot of straight line speed guys against the San Francisco 49ers. And I would argue even the Los Angeles Rams, other than Tutu Atwell and Deshaun Jackson, who of course made that big reception. And so I thought that Tre Flowers deserved to be on the field for the Seahawks. The fact that he was not, I think, suggests that Ken Norton Jr., that Deshaun Shedd as a defensive backs coach, and obviously Pete Carroll, they have all basically moved on from Tre Flowers. And so I would agree with you that it is not surprising that Tre Flowers and his representatives, at least reportedly, have asked to move on. And at the Seahawks, with Tre Brown coming off of IR, as you mentioned, that makes some sense that the Seahawks would be willing to move on from Tre Flowers and see what they have. But again, it is disturbing that they have had the transition that they've had at the cornerback position among the most important positions in today's so pass-happy NFL.
Yeah, I think you and I can agree on the turnover issue. That is a problem any way you slice it. Where we don't agree, and I have been a big supporter of Tre Flowers in the past, but you reach a point with a player, he's in the final year of his rookie contract, we just haven't seen improvement from him. In fact, I've seen regression from him in some areas, and I think a lot of it has to do with confidence. And Pete Carroll was trying to build up that confidence coming out of training camp. Oh, it's the best camp he's ever had. He's really evolved as a player. We're really excited about what he's going to do early on in the season, but you never saw him develop consistent ball skills. He had issues with players that were able to beat him inside, just didn't move well compared to some corners. Had to play 9-10 yards off the ball a lot of the time. The Seahawks had their concerns about him getting toasted on deep balls. It just reached a point after 3 games, they had to make a move. And I would agree with you that Sidney Jones to this point hasn't been any better. You can make an argument statistically he's been worse than what Tre Flowers was, but they had to do something. He was getting exposed out there. Teams were circling him on their game plan. And it's unfortunate because I think when you look back at his 4 seasons in Seattle, 3.5 really, you look back at his time, he started 40 games. This is a former 5th-round pick that came into the league as a safety and was moved to corner. I think he's been a pretty successful 5th-round pick given those circumstances, but the Seahawks kept thinking that he was going to take that next step in his development and become a quality starter. He just never had the consistency and he never had the ball skills to be able to do that. And so I think from both sides' perspective, it is the time to move on. And I do think Tre Flowers is going to have some interest from other teams. I don't know that he gets claimed off waivers, but I would expect once he's cleared waivers, this is a league where the Seahawks are far from the only team that has cornerback issues. I could even see the Steelers, their opponent here, wouldn't be ready for the game on Sunday, but I could see the Steelers taking a look. They've had issues giving up big plays. Their corners have struggled. One former Seahawk, and Akella Witherspoon's only played a handful of snaps on defense, has been a healthy scratch most games. So they've had their share of issues. There will be teams that have interest in him because he's still young. He's got good size. He has started a lot of games in the league. From Seattle's perspective, though, I can understand why they were ready to move on. I can understand why Flowers wanted another opportunity elsewhere. It was just one of those situations where it was time. Mentioning that turnover real quick before we move on to the next segment, as you talked about, there's been a lot of change, but to really put it in perspective, Rob, looking back at August 16th, so we're talking middle of training camp, towards the end of training camp. This was the Seahawks depth chart then. DJ Reed, Akella Witherspoon, Tre Flowers, Pierre Desir, Demarius Randall, Gavin Heslip, Trey Brown, Will Sunderland. Those are the corners that were on the roster, the outside corners. As of today, they have DJ Reed, Sidney Jones, John Reed, Bless Austin, Trey Brown, Nigel Warrior, Gavin Heslip, and Mike Jackson. So only 3 players that were on the roster on August 16th at the corner position are still there. One of them is on the practice squad in Heslip. Another one in Trey Brown still isn't back on the 53. Could be this week. So that means they have one guy, DJ Reed, that was on the roster at the corner position on August 16th that is currently on the 53-man roster. They tried to put a Band-Aid over this issue defensively after they lost Shaquille Griffin. And I think we can both say emphatically that those moves have failed for the Seahawks.
Yeah, we're going to get into that a little bit later when we're giving our positional grades. But yeah, clearly, I mean, the fact that DJ Reed is the longest tenured Seahawk at this point, obviously that just speaks volumes about Seattle's transition to cornerback. But one thing I would mention, again, the fact that this is being reported by Ian Rappaport, the Seahawks are savvy. They are doing the exact same thing that we've seen other NFL teams do. Mention that you are about to release a player to see if you can drum up a little bit of trade interest. We've seen the New England Patriots, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the San Francisco 49ers, several other teams, Arizona Cardinals, Las Vegas Raiders, several other teams release this type of news to the media in the hopes of drumming up some interest. Would not be surprised at all if Tre Flowers winds up being traded rather than just outright released on Wednesday.
Yeah, the Seahawks may be trying to do that, but I think they would have a very hard time doing that with a player that just got benched 2 weeks ago. He's on the final year of his deal. Again, he's a younger player, has good size. There are some reasons why teams might have interest, but the Seahawks weren't able to do this with Jaron Reed, a much bigger contract, obviously. You don't have to worry about that with Flowers. I'd be surprised, though, if they're able to make a trade. Not impossible could happen, but I anticipate that ultimately they're going to end up releasing him, and he's going to hit the waiver wire. Coming up next in the second quarter, Russell Wilson's going to be out for the next 3 weeks minimum as he recovers from finger surgery. Geno Smith will be under center. Could that injury be a precursor to some dramatic changes coming for the Seahawks this upcoming offseason? Rob and I will discuss when we return. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Save time and money using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. Normally in the second quarter, we'd be diving into Throwback Tuesday, breaking down previous matchups between the Seahawks and their upcoming opponent. But in case you've been hiding under a rock, there's been some pretty big developments in Seattle since last Thursday's game against the Los Angeles Rams. The most notable being Russell Wilson's injury. It's a new era in Seattle. The first time since 2011, they are preparing for a game knowing that number 3 is not going to be under center. And this could potentially have not only short-term ramifications for the Seahawks, but it could also have long-term ramifications as far as what to expect this next offseason. And I think this goes beyond just Russell Wilson. Obviously, we'll start off talking about that. But this is something where his injury, if ultimately the Seahawks end up missing the playoffs by a game or two, and they struggle down this stretch without him under center, that everybody's going to look back and be like, man, if they would have had Russell Wilson those couple games, maybe they make the playoffs. We don't know what that could mean next spring, especially considering Russell Wilson, the drama between him and the team, all the trade rumors that were out this past spring. If they don't make the playoffs, then that could really be the stepping stone to number 3 leaving Seattle, or potentially even Pete Carroll being out of Seattle after this season.
Yeah, there's just so many different things that could happen, Corbin, as you mentioned. And, again, I mean, we have typically focused in on looking back in the kind of the rear view mirror. The Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, and the Seattle Seahawks have a storied history. I think Seahawk fans, at least passionate Seahawk fans, remember the Super Bowl years ago, but this is such a different team. The last time that these two teams faced each other was in 2019. Ben Roethlisberger started that game, but he went down to injury. Mason Rudolph wound up becoming the starter there. One of the stars for the Pittsburgh Steelers, James Conner, is no longer with Pittsburgh. He is now a member of the Arizona Cardinals. Russell Wilson was, of course, one of the stars for the Seahawks in that victory at Heinz Field over Pittsburgh. But, of course, as you just mentioned, and we all know that Russell Wilson is not going to be on the field, at least not playing on the field for the Seahawks. So, yeah, I think that this is a more appropriate conversation at this point. And so to me, there's a myriad of factors that we have to look at here. What if Geno Smith comes in and, wins some of these games that we talked about just yesterday that are pretty winnable, at least when you look at some of the quarterbacks that the Seahawks are going to be facing. Ben Roethlisberger in this week against the Steelers, of course, Jameis Winston, the number 1 overall pick, Trevor Lawrence, who has yet to earn his first NFL victory. I think that there is a lot of reason to suggest that the Seahawks can have some success with Geno Smith, besides the fact that he is a talented quarterback. But of course, what if the Seahawks do not? And I like that you mentioned the possibility of a big time kind of divorce with the Seahawks and Russell Wilson. Not that I think that is the most likely scenario. I think that the Seahawks and Russell Wilson both would be better off remaining together, including with the head coach Pete Carroll there. But if Seattle's defense continues to play at this historically bad level as they started off last year, then I think there's plenty of argument to be had that perhaps there has to be a change in the defensive coordinator position. Again, I don't think that's something you're likely to see happen in mid-season, especially given the loyalty that Pete Carroll has always shown towards Ken Norton Jr. but I think that this is a, get it done now type of a business. And when you are employing the oldest head coach in the NFL in Pete Carroll, and if there is any type of serious offseason drama with Russell Wilson, it could be one or the other in terms of the head coach or the quarterback who waves goodbye, or it could be both. This is the time of year, I think, where Seahawks fans who are so used to talking about playoff scenarios right now, and unfortunately don't have the first round draft pick of the 2022 NFL draft this year to kind of bank on should this season fall apart, there's going to be a lot of Seahawks fans out there who are wondering what if in all kinds of different scenarios.
And I know that some of our listeners are going to hate it that we're talking about the potential of Russell Wilson leaving, but I'm sorry, that is a reality. I don't know that it's necessarily a probable one, but last year, I think a lot of the discussion that was going on revolving around number 3 and possible trade rumors, I think there was a lot of smoke. I don't know there was necessarily fire. If they miss the playoffs, I think there's a very good chance, even if it's because Russell Wilson ended up missing 4 or 5 games. I think there's a very good chance with him being 33 years old in November, he may very well decide with his agent, you know what, last year we stirred things up a little bit. This offseason, we are really going to try to force our way out of the door. And he'll have only 2 years left in his contract. It'll be more financially tenable for Seattle to move on from him. And I think that's why the first thing you pointed out, Geno Smith, I'm not going to sit here and say that he's going to remain the starter if he plays really well, because you and I both know that is not the case. When Russell Wilson's healthy, he is going to be back in the lineup. But what if Geno Smith plays really well the next 3-4 games for the Seahawks and they win 2, 3, 4 games with him under center and he looks comfortable running Shane Waldron's offense? If they end up in a situation next spring where Russell Wilson starts airing his grievances again, John Schneider might look at this much differently than he did last March, last April. And instead of just fielding calls and, well, we're not going to actually look into this, he might decide, you know what? Maybe we can look forward to having a younger quarterback that is much cheaper on the roster, and we can start plugging in some of these gaps that are holes on our roster elsewhere with that extra financial flexibility. And maybe they could go into next year, depending how Geno Smith plays. Maybe Geno's just the placeholder. They can get a couple first-round picks dealing away Russell Wilson, probably 3 of them to trade Russell Wilson, but maybe they would move a few of their other veterans like Bobby Wagner and start to stockpile some draft picks so you can get younger, and it would be a true rebuild, something that we have not seen since 2010 when Schneider and Carroll first got here, 2011. Those 2 years, they had so much turnover on the roster. I could foresee that happening if things play out a certain way. If Geno Smith really struggles, though, it's going to be clear evidence to Russell Wilson and to the Seahawks that we have to have you under center, and they're going to do everything they can to appease him. And in that case, Pete Carroll might be the one that ends up being the odd man out next year, being 70 years old. Maybe at that point he would just retire and decide, I'm ready to be done coaching. There are just so many dominoes that could fall in different directions here, depending what happens with the defense. If the defense keeps playing like they have, like you said, I think I would go as far as saying that the Pete Carroll domino might be the one to fall, not just Ken Norton Jr., because the Seahawks may decide at that point, we're still building around Russell Wilson. Maybe they want an offensive head coach, which they haven't had the last 10 years. There's a lot of different things that could play out here, and there's so much uncertainty that you and I aren't going to be able to sit here and be able to project what happens. But I think that there is a pretty good chance that we could see substantial changes coming up this offseason with this franchise. It just remains to be seen what those changes are going to be, and the next several weeks are going to dictate that.
Yeah, no question about it. I think that the true blue Seahawks fans who are asking us to basically break down the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we're going to be doing that, throughout Wednesday's show. But at the same time, I think that you have to be realistic in some ways from a schematic perspective, from a building up the roster perspective. Then these next couple of weeks, Corbin, are as fascinating as any of the Seahawks have had throughout Russell Wilson's era, at least once it was established that he was going to become the MVP kind of caliber player that he has become, the future Hall of Fame player in which he has become. And that is one thing that we cannot stress enough. I think that you agree with me, as do most Seahawks fans, most logical people out there, that there is no question the Seahawks are going to be very, very hesitant, very, very opposed to the idea of trading away a player that is, at least in my opinion, the best in franchise history. One that John Schneider deserves, and Pete Carroll as well, deserve an awful lot of credit for bringing him in as a third-round draft pick in the first place, having the confidence in him to start him as a rookie. Of course, the team is going to be loath to trade that player away. But as you mentioned, just the salary being as bloated as it is for Russell Wilson, for Bobby Wagner, for Jamel Adams, the Seahawks are kind of stuck. And so if they do decide to blow things up and try to rebuild this team, and the way that they did initially when they were not paying the quarterback as much, and they had that extra financial flexibility, as you mentioned, to be able to kind of bring in some extra players or do some other things that way, then that's one of the ways that you can do it. And so there's a number of veteran quarterbacks out there besides Geno Smith that might be available to them. I mean, I would argue that you could look at what the Carolina Panthers and former Seahawks longtime scout Scott Fitterer has done with Sam Darnold, and he has had his struggles here recently, but still, that's the way that they have gone. The New Orleans Saints, who we're going to be talking about here shortly, a week from now, the Seahawks' next opponent after Pittsburgh, and what they've done with Jameis Winston. It'll be interesting to see the way that the Saints have gone from the offensive showcase that they were with Sean Payton, and of course, the immortal Drew Brees, and now they're a defensive-oriented club. I think that that's something that Pete Carroll is still looking to do, that's always been in his nature. So I think it's going to be fascinating over the next couple of weeks to see what Geno Smith can do and what the Seahawks might do as a result of that.
Yeah, and as far as we know, Russell Wilson could come back in 4 games. The Seahawks, maybe they win 2 of the next 3 and they're above 500 and they're right in the mix for a wild card spot. And maybe Russell Wilson and the offense really start clicking late in the year. They slip into the playoffs as a wild card and they're a team nobody wants to play. I mean, there are so many different outcomes that could happen. It's still only week 6. But with that being said, I don't think that this is a topic that should be walked away from at this point. I think that with what we saw in the offseason with Russell Wilson and the Seahawks and some of the other decisions they've made, the inability to draft in the last several drafts and the misfires they've had in early rounds, there's all these different factors that stack up that tell you, you know what, maybe this was the first domino that needed to fall for them to really decide, you know what, we're not just going to do a reset like we did for the 2018 season. We're just blowing this thing up. And maybe it will be one of those things where they just make a couple of moves and they're still building around Russell Wilson. There are just so many different things that could happen. But I do think the fact that they are now going to see what life is like without him for several weeks, I do think that that could be that first step that could lead to some significant changes depending how things end up playing out. It's going to be very fascinating to watch unfold the next several weeks. We come back in the third quarter. We're going to flip back to our quarterly grade card. Yesterday, we looked on the offensive side of the football, handed out grades at each position group. We're going to do the same thing today with Seattle's heavily scrutinized defense. You won't want to miss it. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're back and better than ever, and all eyes are on the gridiron as teams are back on for another football season. As always, BetOnline is your top spot for all the pro and college football action this season. They've got a new updated site and interface, more odds, props, and contests. BetOnline continues to be the top source for everything football. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Use the promo code LOCKEDON to receive your bonus. From football, basketball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. Yesterday, we dished out our quarterly report card for the Seahawks offensive position groups. We're going to switch gears today to the defensive side of the football, and it's been pretty ugly, Rob, the last several weeks. The Seahawks became just the 4th team since the merger on Thursday night to give up more than 450 total yards in 4 consecutive games. That is not the type of history that you want to be making on defense. And yet that's kind of become a regular theme for the Seahawks because they were smashing unideal yardage records early in the season in 2020. So the grades on the defensive side of the football probably aren't going to look near as favorable as the ones that were on offense yesterday. And quite frankly, we hit a few of those groups hard too because the offense has been inconsistent throughout the 2021 season. Let's start at defensive end. There was such high expectations for the Seahawks at that position, bringing back Carlos Dunlap, having Alton Robinson, Darrell Taylor, signing Kerry Hyder. LJ Collier was supposed to factor in with that group. Rasheem Green had a strong ending to training camp in the preseason to sustain his roster spot. So much depth. And yet it feels like this group has underachieved throughout these first 5 games.
I think they absolutely has. As you just said, 5 games. The Seahawks have 10 sacks. 4 of them are from Darrell Taylor. If you would have told me that Al Woods would have more sacks than Carlos Dunlap after 5 games, I would have thought you were crazy, Corbin. But in fact, that is the reality of what is going on with the 2021 Seattle Seahawks. I mean, to me, the defensive end position has been as disappointing as any on the Seahawks roster. I think that you have to give it a D at this point. And I do stress D because Darrell Taylor, to me, has been the only player that you really can start to hype up a little bit. Now, I think some of it is because you are seeing some players like a Rasheem Green slide inside, an LJ Collier, a Kerry Hyder slide inside. You're seeing Carlos Dunlap drop into coverage. Again, that D drop back as often as he is. And that to me is one of the reasons why I don't give the Seahawks a failing grade at the defensive end position, because I think that you have to throw some of the shade on that position to Seattle's defensive coaches and just trying to get a little bit cute, frankly, and asking some of their most talented pass rushers of the defensive ends, asking them to drop back in coverage rather than go after the quarterback.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little more generous with my grade. And one of the reasons why I'm going to give the defensive ends a C+, you just mentioned, I do think a lot of the trouble that the Seahawks are having consistently registering a pass rush, I think it falls back on the coaching staff. And I think they have done kind of a poor job figuring out rotations. It hasn't helped that Alton Robinson's been dealing with a achy knee the last couple of games because I have been hammering on the table saying he needs to play more. And when he finally got that chance, he got banged up a little bit. But Darrell Taylor's been fantastic. 4 sacks in 5 games. He's really becoming their best pass rusher, a true weapon off the edge, exactly what they hoped he was going to be when they drafted him in the 2nd round a couple years ago. So that's a really positive development. I think Rasheem Green has had a pretty solid year. Not a lot of pass rushing production necessarily, but he's held up well against the run. He's given them his most consistent play. I think Kerry Hyder's done some nice things this year. The one that I've been really disappointed with has been Dunlap, though, and he's had some pressures. It's not like he's been completely invisible, but to not have any sacks the first 5 games of the season, he hasn't been helped at all by the fact, as you mentioned, they're dropping him back a fair amount into coverage. I don't care if you do that a few plays once in a while, but it seems like they have done that a lot this year. And why would you re-sign him with the money that they gave him to be dropping back in coverage like that? It just doesn't add up to me. And so I'm going to go with a C+. I think they have been solid, but they have not met my expectations, particularly in the pass rushing department. Now, when you go to the interior, the defensive tackles, this is a group that has been pretty solid most of the year, despite the fact that the Seahawks have a top 5 worst rushing defense in the NFL. I don't know necessarily that falls on your top couple guys in the DT position. The biggest issue has been depth throughout this year, which we thought might be a problem after losing Jarran Reed during free agency.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that's important here. I mean, he is their most gifted defensive tackle. Poona Ford, at the same time, however, I think has been a disappointment at this point. And so again, I think that you are, giving the Seahawks defense a little bit more or a higher grade than I would be. You give them a B minus. I struggle with anything higher than a C plus. I just had huge expectations for Poona Ford. I will say this about Al Woods and again Brian Monet. I have been very impressed by some of their snaps. The fact that they have both been able to provide more pass rush than I think that you can reasonably expect for men who are 340 plus pounds. But the fact that you have not seen more from Poona Ford, you have not seen more from LJ Collier, who they do slide inside a fair amount of the time. Again, Rasheem Green, Kerry Hyder, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that none of the Seattle's top 10 tacklers so far this season play that defensive tackle position. The fact that Seattle has been among the worst against the run all year long, despite the fact that they often have been playing that 5-2 defense designed entirely to try to be able to clog up the line of scrimmage. To me, that is one of their true indictments of Seattle's defense at this point. It has been a disappointing group. There is no question that they have talent, but it has not yet turned into production.
Yeah, I'm going to go with B minus, a little higher grade than you, because I do think Poona Ford had his best game of the season against the Rams. I thought he played pretty well. We finally saw him come out a little bit as a rusher. That's been the biggest disappointment for me. I think Al Woods has been one of the best players on their defense this year. And maybe that's not saying a lot given how much they've struggled, but he has been impressive. Every game, it seems like he's given them at least one solid pass rush. He's held up well against the run. He's had a couple really nice stops on third down runs, including on Thursday night that forced the Rams to kick a field goal. And so I think that he's been really solid. Brian Monet had that great opener, and then he got banged up, and he has not looked the same since he came back a few weeks ago. I have to question how healthy he is, given the way that he played in Indianapolis. In the last couple of games, he's been pushed around more than I anticipated. So a little disappointed in that. Wish we could see the week one Brian Monet, but again, I don't know how healthy he is. LJ Collier's been a healthy scratch 3 games, and when he has played, he's been blown off the ball consistently. He's looked horrific out there. Robert Kimdiche has been very hit and miss. He's given them some great plays, then there's been some really bad ones. So the depth is really an issue at this position, but I still think Poona Ford's been solid. He's coming off a good game. Al Woods has been really good in the middle, so I'll give him a B minus. Now, let's go to linebackers, because I think this is the position that I think our listeners might be most surprised to hear what I have to say on this. But we'll start with you. Where do you stand on the way the linebackers have played in this first quarter of the season?
You have to be careful, because I think that, when you have heightened expectations, I mean, we know that Bobby Wagner, again, is another future Hall of Famer. He is a multiple All-Pro, and I think that he's played pretty solid this year. And I've been very critical of Bobby Wagner at times. I mean, his statistics this season are through the roof, as you might expect, considering the way that Seattle's defense has basically funneled action to the linebackers, both he and Jordan Brooks. Jordan Brooks is among the top 10 tacklers in the league at this point, or at least has been throughout much of the first quarter of the season. But at the same time, while their tackle numbers may be up, their effectiveness has been down, especially in pass coverage. As many times you've seen Jordan Brooks, especially, being basically lagging behind in coverage. So I think that a C is about what you can expect at point, I should say a C is about what you can realistically give Seattle's linebackers at this point. And that to me is a huge disappointment, considering how much money is being spent on Bobby Wagner, the first round tender or the first round draft selection, obviously, that was Jordan Brooks. And again, just the expectations. This was supposed to be one of the strengths of Seattle's defense. To me, there's been so many games where it's basically been a yawn rather than a wow at the linebacker position for the Seahawks.
I'm going to give him a C minus, and honestly, I'm surprised it went that high. And it's not necessarily an indictment on Bobby Wagner. I think that Bobby Wagner has had a really solid season. It has not been his best by any means, and he has had some issues in coverage the last couple games. I thought the Rams picked on him. I thought the Titans game, which it wasn't necessarily his fault. It seemed like the way the Seahawks were playing him altered his performance. The Titans were able to throw the ball over the top. He made adjustments, started going back deeper, and then they started doing the checkdowns and had success doing that. I don't necessarily know that that's his fault. it seems like there have been a lot of scheme issues all around this defense that have impacted players like Wagner, even, who's a sensational talent. I think he's still a top 3, top 5 linebacker in this league. But he's had his issues. I've been extremely disappointed by the way Jordan Brooks has played. And I was hoping that Pete Carroll would shed a little more light on that during his Monday press conference. But, of course, he's not going to be throwing players under the bus. So he said he's working on it, particularly in coverage. I just have been really disappointed because we saw how well he played late last season, end of his rookie year, especially made strides in coverage. And I feel like he has regressed tremendously in that particular aspect during the first 5 games of the season. I feel like his gap integrity as a linebacker playing run defense has not been as good either. He looks lost at times, which I did not anticipate that I was going to be saying in his second season. So really a lot of sophomore year growing pains for him. And maybe some of it falls back on the scheme, a lot of coaching related issues that have been brought to the forefront, but he just has not played anywhere close to my expectations. I thought this kid might be a Pro Bowl caliber player this year. Right now, I find it hard to keep him on the field at times because he's been such a liability in coverage, whether that's completely on him or not. They have looked better when they've been in dime packages with Ryan Neal out there as a linebacker than what they have with Jordan Brooks out there. And Darrell Taylor's done well as a pass rusher, but I haven't been overly impressed with him setting the edge at the Sam linebacker spot either. So I think I'm being generous with a C- overall. This group has really underachieved. Now let's get to the corners real quick. We're not going to spend too much time because I don't want to turn this into a bash fest. And we already talked about them quite a bit in the first quarter, but there's really no way to look at this group from a positive standpoint, aside from the fact that DJ Reed has given them a couple of decent starts at the right cornerback spot. He looks much more comfortable there than when he started on the left side early in the year, but they've already changed starters. The former starter, Tre Flowers, is about to get released. They've had incredible turnover at that position. They're just now going to get their rookie Trey Brown back. This, to me, has easily been the biggest weakness on this football team through the first 5 weeks, and the defense has suffered tremendously because of the struggles that they have had at the cornerback position.
No question about it. I mean, you kind of stole the positivity there with the improved play that we've seen from DJ Reed at his more comfortable right position. Otherwise, the positives, I would say, might be if you have fantasy football players who are playing against the Seahawks cornerbacks, that might be a positive, because otherwise it really has been pretty ugly. And, you don't have to be a longtime football analyst to see that Seattle has just struggled basically against virtually every different passing attack that they have faced. And so that is obviously the biggest concern. I will say this, that I am intrigued by Sidney Jones, as we talked about before. I'm also intrigued by Bless Austin and John Reed, as well as Trey Brown. And to me, there are some intriguing athletes at those positions, but the fact that all of them are smaller guys than what Pete Carroll has always prioritized in the past, to me, is one of the real concerns about the way that the roster is being built. One of the things I thought was always so cool about the way that the Seahawks were building up their roster is it just really felt like the Seahawks coaching staff and their scouting staff were completely in lockstep. To me, at the cornerback position, we are seeing such a difference, such a variance of opinions in the types of players that are being brought on the Seattle's defensive back, cornerback specifically, that is, to me, one of the most concerning things about where the Seahawks are right now and where they might be going in the near future.
Yeah, Rob, I'm going to give them a D-. I thought about going with the big old F because they have been so bad the first 5 games, but that would be discrediting the way that DJ Reed has played in the last couple of games. He does look a lot more comfortable on the right side. I don't know what the biggest difference for him is, but he just seemed like he was out of place playing on the left side the first 3 games. Since he's moved back to the right cornerback spot, he's been getting his hands on the football. Teams aren't testing him near as much as they are the other corner, Sidney Jones. So I feel like they've made some progress there. Marquise Blair had a decent game out of the slot on Thursday night too. So from the slot corner perspective, maybe they're starting to figure out that rotation too. But otherwise, this position has been nothing but an unmitigated disaster. And I don't know that there are any signs that it's going to get better moving forward with the personnel that they have. Maybe holding out hope that Trey Brown can be that difference maker for him. But for now, not many answers currently on the roster with that shuffled group of corners. Now, real quick, let's get to the safeties. A lot of star power with Quandre Diggs and Jamel Adams, but at least in the case of one of those players, haven't necessarily lived up to their star billing during the early going of the season, which has played a role in the struggles the Seahawks have had on defense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to draw that immediate distinction because, the Seahawks do have some star players. I think that Quandre Diggs has continued to play like a star. Jamel Adams, I think, sometimes gets, too much attention. Any of his struggles gets highlighted. Any of the spectacular plays. We've seen some of the absolutely dynamic closing speed that he offers. And so I think that Jamel Adams deserves probably a C at this point. But Quandre Diggs, I think that he has been easily Seattle's most reliable, consistent defensive player. So I would argue that he's very much in that A-B+ kind of a range. Ryan Neal, I think, has also provided some pretty quality play there. So again, I think that this is a B for me at the safety position, which would be my highest graded position for the Seahawks. But at the same time, were we expecting this, considering what Quandre Diggs was as a Pro Bowler and Jamel Adams at least flashing that all-pro ability? Again, to me, the real indictment is on Seattle's defensive coaching staff. The fact that these players who have the talent and at least in some cases have the salary to suggest that they are going to be absolute difference makers, there hasn't been difference makers on the defensive side of the ball for the Seahawks throughout the 2021 season.
Yeah, I went with a B-, and Jamel Adams would probably get a C- in my grade book because he has left some plays in the field. I think the Seahawks, we talked about yesterday, have done a disservice to him with the way they are using him. So I'm not going to go lower than that on the grades. He has shown his closing speed. He's made some big hits, just not a lot of the impact plays that you want from the highest paid safety in the NFL. And the Quandre Diggs standpoint, I think he's played like an all-pro this year, and his numbers might not reflect that because he's had to try to cover up the issues the Seahawks have at corner and at linebacker in coverage, being the single high safety a lot of the time, has kind of left him with some big messes to try to clean up. But we've also seen him have picks in back-to-back games. They haven't been giving up those long seam routes, those long corner routes. They haven't been giving those up consistently because number 6 is in the secondary and he's provided a true dependable center fielder back there, just as he has ever since they traded for him a couple years ago. And I still think the Seahawks are going to regret that they did not get a long-term deal worked out with him before the season, because his tape is going to look good to other teams, and I think he's going to have a market when free agency gets here come March. So I think I would give him a solid A. He's played that well to me. He's been the best player on Seattle's defense through the first 5 games. Ryan Neal's looked good when he's been out there. So I'll give this group a solid B- for the first 5 games. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen every day. Now make sure your second listen is the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson give you the expert NFL analysis in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available on all platforms. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. Coming up on our Wednesday episode, a more traditional week. We are back to Matchup Wednesday. We'll be breaking down matchups to watch when the Seahawks are on offense and when they're on defense, going on the road to Pittsburgh to face the Steelers. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.